Wow. Cool, man. Okay. The other flyer here is for, this is our first flyer 15 years ago, and a very special picture of Maxwell on the front, only available from the Bettman Archives. And if you'd like a copy of this, you know, if you want to see what I looked like 15 years ago, you can see me on the back. But Maxwell is the real star of this on the front. The experimental apparatus here he's using to measure the absolute value of the ohm, right at this time they're putting 1,500 miles of copper underneath the Atlantic Ocean, transatlantic cable. The value of the ohm was very important. So feel free to take one of these as well. Let me start with a disclaimer. I am not a historian. Historians spend their entire professional life in the field of history. My professional life has been spent in the field of numerical, high-frequency, planar electromagnetics. While in the 22 years I've spent in that field, I started to wonder, just who is this Maxwell fellow anyway? Historians consider him the equal of Newton and Einstein. However, while you go to any bookstore and find biographies of both Newton and Einstein, you don't find any biographies of Maxwell. Well, I started looking around. It turns out you can find them, but you have to really look hard. And I essentially started taking day trips into the field of history in my spare time, and found out I would find bright, shiny pebbles. And I'd collect the shiny pebbles and bring them home. And what I'd like to do this afternoon with you is share some of those shiny pebbles with you. I'll be doing quotes in different voices, so that it's clear that something is being quoted. The first quote is from one of these four people on these 4 U.S. stamps. One of these 4 American scientists said, "The most significant event of the 19th century will be judged as Maxwell's discovery of the laws of electrodynamics. The American Civil War will pale into provincial insignificance in comparison with its most important scientific discovery of the same decade." The person who said this is Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman is the author of Quantum Electrodynamics, QED. Quantum electrodynamics is the successor to Maxwell's equations. Maxwell's equations fail for low power when you can count individual photons. Quantum electrodynamics works for this case and all others. In the background are Feynman diagrams illustrating electron-photon interactions. If you'd like to learn a little bit about quantum electrodynamics and you don't have a background in quantum theory, I highly recommend a book by Richard Feynman. It's called QED, The Strange Theory of Matter and Light. It is a very easily read book and extremely interesting. In fact, if you haven't read any books by Richard Feynman, there's quite a few of them. I highly recommend you go out and get them and read them. He's a beautiful example of what I call the genius of simplicity. He takes very difficult problems and makes it seem like the solution is so simple. But it takes a genius to do that. Josiah Willard Gibbs is the father of modern thermodynamics. He also, little known, formalized vector calculus after Maxwell's death. Maxwell did not have the benefit of things like div, del dot, or curl, del cross. These were done after Maxwell's death. John von Neumann is my connection to Maxwell through computer architecture. He is also one of the architects of quantum theory. Barbara McIntosh did work in DNA. No connection to Maxwell as far as I know. However, we are both Cornell graduates. How do I do next page here? Page down. Oh, okay, beautiful. Here we go. Okay, thank you. I will discuss Maxwell's ancestor, birth, and youth. His high school was taken at Edinburgh Academy. College was University of Edinburgh and Cambridge. He became a professor at Aberdeen, Marshall College in Aberdeen. He was terminated from that position, had difficulty getting another one. He then finally found a position at King's College in London. He retired from that and was called back to establish Cavendish Laboratory, founding director. We'll discuss his illnesses, death, his contributions to electromagnetics, and conclusion. The history of Maxwell's ancestry goes all the way back to 1568. Mary, Queen of Scots, was a Catholic queen of a Protestant country. And Catholics and Protestants did not like each other at all. She was forced to flee Scotland after her battle with the Lords of Scotland. She lost her battle with the Lords of Scotland. She fled Scotland seeking safety against all advice from her cousin to the south, Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth immediately, thank you, Queen Elizabeth immediately through, Queen Elizabeth immediately threw Mary, Queen of Scots, into prison. The Clarks, C-L-E-R-K is pronounced Clark. In America we like to pronounce it Clerk, but the correct pronunciation is Clark. The Clarks of Aberdeen found themselves on the losing side of that battle in 1568, and they found themselves compelled to leave Aberdeen and seek safety to the south in Pennacook, south of Edinburgh. They became the Clarks of Pennacook. Mary, Queen of Scots, after about 10 years, was executed by Queen Elizabeth I. It was a very gory execution. She was beheaded. It didn't go right. And the evening before, or just before she was executed, she gave these jewels to her maid. These jewels were given to Mary, Queen of Scots by the Clarks of Pennacook. They're on display today in the National Museum of Scotland. The Pennacook jewels, a direct connection to Maxwell's ancestry. We'll discuss his ancestry, starting with the red-circled people, John Clark, first baronet, Sir John Clark, the second baronet, John Clark of Eldon, great-great-uncle, James Clerk Maxwell, that's his grandfather, same name. Here's his father, John Clerk Maxwell, and there's our fella, James Clerk Maxwell. Important players here, his father, John Clark, Isabella Clark, his aunt, we'll refer to her as Mrs. Wedderburn. Remember Mrs. Wedderburn, his aunt, she's an important player. Her daughter, Jemima, we'll call her cousin Jemima, Maxwell's cousin, is also an important player. Remember cousin Jemima. Now, I promised you a presentation on Maxwell. I've spent a lot of time talking about the Clarks. Why am I talking about the Clarks? Here's where the Maxwell name appears in the family tree. How did it get there? It's a very bizarre story. Sir John Clark, the second baronet, had a brother, William. William married one Agnes Maxwell. That's where the Maxwell names comes from. You know, usually the wife takes on the husband's name, but in this case the husband took on the wife's name because it was a condition that Agnes had a very large estate, and the condition of inheriting the Maxwell estate, William had to take on the Maxwell name. So he became William Maxwell. They had a daughter, Dorothea. Now down here, how did Sir George Clark get the Maxwell name? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about Sir George. Sir George could do some things well, some things he couldn't do so well. One of the things he could do well was spend lots of money. One of the things he couldn't do so well was earn money. This estate was an income source. You had farmers that were renting out farms, and you could also sell off pieces of the estate to make income, support your lifestyle. So how does he get the estate? He marries Dorothea, the daughter of William and Agnes. And as a condition of inheriting the estate, he also inherits the last name of Maxwell. And you can follow the estate down through the family tree just by seeing where the Maxwell name goes. Notice that the sisters and brothers are all Clark. The one that got the estate takes the name Maxwell. Hey, we'll start up here at the top. I think we'll start up at the top. Oh, seem to be disconnected or something. Okay, there we go. Sir John Clark, the first baronet, member of Scottish Parliament, the final Scottish Parliament. It was dissolved and he helped oversee the dissolvement. Actually, it was unified with the English Parliament. Scottish and English parliaments were unified to create the British Parliament, the United Kingdom. He helped oversee that, direct Maxwell ancestor. They loved to tell stories around the fireplace in the evening in the Maxwell home. One of the stories they would tell was how he returned home one night in 1692 and found 16 robbers whom he successfully fought off. Must have been quite a good fighter. His son, Sir John Clark, second baronet, was a lawyer. A lot of the Maxwells are a lot of the Clarks are lawyers. And the Clark family, they're all fairly wealthy. It's not a low-class family. It's a fairly high-class family. And but he was also a very good musician, didn't like to play in public, felt it was inappropriate for one of his position. He was one of the best composers Scotland ever produced, and an antiquarian. He wrote a 6-volume history of Britain, entirely in Latin. Now, he took part of his education at the University of Leiden in Germany, and he started getting interested in this topic called mathematics. And back then, today mathematics is a very important topic for engineering and science. You need to have strong background in mathematics. It's very powerful and useful. Back then, it was viewed something like we view video games today. What are you doing scribbling that useless stuff on a piece of paper? Why don't you do something real, something useful? And his father, the first baronet, when he found out that his son was interested in mathematics, he wrote to him some very important advice. He said, "The Italians call a fool a little mathematician. I hope you are not so great a fool as to aim at being a famous one." Fortunately, his ancestor, our James Clerk Maxwell, did not follow that advice. John Clark of Eldon, remember the uncle off to the side, great-great-uncle? Very good artist. He owned coal mines. He wondered why the rock was layered in the coal mines. And his buddy, James Hutton, wondered the same thing. He and James went all around, traveling all over the countryside, and John Clark would sketch outcroppings, and James Hutton would figure out why the outcroppings are that way. The rock rises up, wears down, makes sedimentary rock, rises up again. And he wrote a book on it, Theory of the Earth, illustrated by John Clark of Eldon, and that's the founding document of modern geology. He also was an expert on naval combat. Just curious, how many people have heard of Battle of Trafalgar? Important in British history. Yes, a few of you have. Okay, really critical battle. The normal way of doing naval battle back then, the sailing ships, there's no steam, is ships would form a line, and they get closer and closer. When they're in cannon range, they start firing at each other and try to blast the other out of the water. Of course, the sides of they know this is going to happen, so the sides of the ships are very strong. A lot of the cannonballs just bounce off. So John Clark of Eldon figured a different battle strategy. He figured, we'll come in at right angles. We'll take a blistering fire from their cannons as we come in, but then when we break the line, now we can fire right down the line, and the rear ends of the ship are quite fragile. Boom, 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 boom. Take one after another. And then you can take care of the rest. John Clark never sailed on a ship in his entire life. He's got the portrait here. It has ships in the background on a naval chart here. Never sailed on a ship in his entire life. The way he tested out his theories was with little boats in a pond. Wrote a book on it, and it was this strategy was used in 3 battles: Battle of Chesapeake, Battle of the Nile, and the final and greatest sailing ship battle of all time, the Battle of Trafalgar. Napoleon, who had conquered most of Europe, continental Europe, had his navy direct orders, French and Spanish fleet combined, direct orders to destroy the British Navy, whom they outnumbered, fewer boats on the British side. Destroy the British Navy and transport troops to Britain to conquer Britain. And by Admiral Nelson, his flagship, the Victory, was Admiral Nelson used this strategy to utterly destroy, almost completely destroy the French and Spanish fleet. They were never an important influence in the rest of the Napoleonic Wars, and they avoided the invasion and conquering of Britain. Admiral Nelson did not survive the battle. He was taken out by a sniper. If you want to see a statue of him today in London, in Trafalgar Square. Grandfather, James Clerk Maxwell, in contrast, sailed on a boat quite a bit. In fact, he was a captain. He was shipwrecked once in the Hooghly near Calcutta. And in those days, most sailors did not know how to swim, so you either grabbed on something that floated or you drowned. And what his grandfather did was grabbed on his bagpipes, blew up the bagpipes, floated on in. When he got to shore, he started playing, as they described it, in an uncouth fit, i.e. very loudly. Two purposes in mind: to act as a homing beacon for other sailors, other shipwrecked sailors, and the second one was to keep the hungry tigers in the jungle from coming and eating them. Fortunately, it worked because his son, youngest son, is Maxwell's father. Cousin Jemima, the one over in the corner, very, very precious person. She was a world-class artist. You can get her paintings today, but they are extremely expensive. You have photographic memory, get details, see a scene once and get all the details perfectly as she painted it. The thing that's most valuable about her is that she, before the days of photography, she painted watercolors of James as a young boy. I'll show you some of the world-class artists. I'll show you some of those paintings as we go through. Okay, condition of inheritance. This is Maxwell's father now, John Clark. Changed his last name to Maxwell. He lives in Edinburgh. There's no place to live on the estate. It's very rural Scotland, long ways away. Lives with his mother until her death in 1824 at 14 India Street. Remember 14 India Street, that's an important address. I'll be mentioning it again. He's 36 years old, and she's 34 when he marries Frances Kay in 1826. This is very, very old by Victorian standards for getting married, but it's a marriage that worked well. This is Frances, his wife. This is Maxwell's mother on the right with the black hair. And her sister, her little sister, Jane, I'll refer to as Miss Jane or Miss Kay. She never married. Both ladies very important in Maxwell's life. Please remember Miss Kay on the left and his mother Frances on the right. One thing I like to ask people to do, it's a little hard for us engineers to do, being so used to working with numbers and such. What I'd like you to do is look at these pictures, look at the people, look at their faces, and try to read them. What kind of person was they? What was their nature? What are they thinking? And when I try to read Frances, I see all kinds of positive things. Strong, protective, thoughtful, courteous, just from looking at the paper. You have to do this sort of thing when you play poker. Right? Poker is popular in the States. You probably do it here too. You've got to read what the person is holding. Is the person really holding a straight flush or not? And you've got to look at their face and read them. And this is the same thing here. I'll ask you to do that with a few more, especially the eyes. You can tell a lot with the eyes. Look at her eyes. And here she is. Well, she soon became pregnant after marriage and gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, who did not survive. And then on the 13th of June, 1831, 174 and 1/2 years ago, she gave birth to our James Clerk Maxwell. Here's a picture of mother and son painting. Again, look at those eyes. It's like she's looking across the centuries, reading us instead of we are reading her. And look at James himself. Any mother will, there's two kinds of kids. There's some that like to cling and hold on to their mothers, and there are others that want to be someplace else. Well, look at James's hands here. He's not holding on to his mother. He wants to be someplace else. I'm sure he was quite a handful. In fact, they may have had difficulty doing this painting because he doesn't want to stay still. And this was painted by her father. Here's the earliest known sketch of Maxwell. And look at those eyes. Any mother will tell you this kid is going to be a handful. There's fire in those eyes. He's going to be troublesome. And indeed he is. And look at the owl. I'm sure it's a stuffed owl. If it weren't a stuffed owl, instead of his thumb being hidden, the thumb would be eaten by now. But I like to pretend the owl is alive and look at the look of terror on the eyes of the owl. Under his foot here on the left side of the picture is trapped a frog. And over here on this side, you can just make it out, is a salamander. He loved animals. Now the maps I forgot to mention. The maps are from the 1892 Encyclopedia Britannica. Maxwell had a series of articles in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Mother and the mom and dad have this kid, and they decide it's time to move out of the city and move to a country estate in rural Scotland. They're in Edinburgh, right here, and it's 2 days carriage ride to what they call Glenlair. It's in Kirkcudbrightshire. Here's a detail of the map. It's on the River Ore. Ore W means Ore water, or the River Ore. We follow the Ore up. And it leads right here. Right there is where they're going to build the estate. They're going to call it Glenlair. Nearest large town, Castle Douglas. Dumfries over here is another large town. Lockerbie is just off to the right side of the map. We took a trip there this summer. Went by train from Edinburgh for 1 hour to Lockerbie, and then 1 hour by car from Lockerbie to Glenlair. The Lockerbie is kind of a special place for us because in 1988, the wife of the present owner of Glenlair spent her entire Christmas holiday preparing meals for the first responders to Pan Am 103 flight disaster. A terrorist bomb took down a 747. 270 people died in that disaster. 35 of them were Syracuse University students. I had just finished a visiting professorship at Syracuse University a little bit before that. So they've got an estate now, and they're building their manor house. This is a sketch taken from a Jemima watercolor. This sketch is in the biography of Maxwell. It was written by Lewis Campbell. Remember the name Campbell. It's a definitive, it's a primary historical source. The Campbell biography, written in 1882, is available only in the rare book rooms of large libraries. I managed to get hold of a copy. I scanned every single page of it. OCR'd it, character recognition. Put it in a PDF file. You can download it. It's about 5 megabyte download, 700 pages. Download it from the web, from our website, sonnetsoftware.com. If you want to read about Maxwell from a person who knew him personally for most of his life, that's the book to get. This sketch and many of the other images are taken from that biography. In this case, this is John Clark right here, and he's overseeing the women folk here are picking stones. I grew up on a farm and I've done this. You pick the stones to make it easier to till the soil. It is hard, sweaty, dirty, back-breaking work. Is John Clark mean or something, having the women doing this hard work? And then you look at the upper left-hand corner and you see some men up here. The men are digging. And Glenlair itself is on a small hill. It is a very deep basement. And I think the men here are digging the basement for Glenlair. If you've ever dug dirt in hard, stony, clayey soil, that is even harder work than picking stones. So they actually have the menfolk doing the harder of the two jobs here. Here's Glenlair 5 years after Maxwell's death. The servants' cottage here is still in good condition. We stayed there for 2 nights this last summer. Listened very carefully for Maxwell's ghost, creaking floorboards, didn't hear anything. Here's what it looked like actually about 5 years ago. There was a fire in 1929. The fire trucks came, but they had no water. So all they could do was help take stuff out of the house and watch it burn. At this point, there's no grass growing on the walls here. There's no bushes or anything. This roof of this small foyer, the roof is still intact. During our visit this summer, that's what it looks like. We now have grass growing on the roofs. A bush is growing. The roof has collapsed on this foyer. Part of the reason are these crow-like birds. They're literally picking the house to pieces, in addition to wind, snow, and rain. That little foyer on the front, it was built by Maxwell. Discovered something new on my trip I've never seen reported before. If you walk in the front door here, turn to the right, as I'm sure Maxwell himself did many, many times, and then look down, pull a tarp off the floor. You see this beautiful tile floor. Nothing but triangles and squares. I think, I've not tested it, but I think the sides of the triangles are just about right, that the ratio would be the golden ratio. I haven't actually checked that. The colors are white, red, green, and blue. Red, green, and blue. Very important colors to Maxwell. We'll return to that. Here's Glen Lair today. This is the first view you have of it as you come up the dirt road leading to the estate. This is a disgrace. One of the three greatest physicists of all time deserves better than this. The owner needs about $200,000 US to stabilize these walls. These walls are decaying. It's dangerous to go in there because a stone might bonk you on the head. Repair this roof and then restore this roof and put a small visitor center there and become kind of an electromagnetic holy site that we can make pilgrimages to. And believe me, after working with Maxwell's equations for 22 years, visiting this site was a very emotional experience. My company is prepared to do quite a bit of help on that, but we need at least one other wealthy individual or corporation that might be willing to come in and help with expenses to help preserve Glen Lair. If you know of anyone, please put them in touch with me. Maxwell was always interested in how things were working. He would often ask things like, "Show me how it does." And if you didn't give an adequate answer, he'd become even more emphatic, sometimes quite frustrating, in fact. Here is a sketch taken from another Jemima watercolor, Maxwell, 1837, so that makes him about 6 years old. Let's find him. Too young, adults, dancer, adults, violin player, there he is. There's Maxwell, and he's not watching the dancer, he's watching the violin player. He's trying to figure out how the violin works. Now, this is actually foreshadowing, even though Jemima didn't realize it at the time. Violin works when you draw a bow across the string vibrates transversely, side to side. It creates vibrations in the air. The sound waves come to us with a longitudinal vibration, back and forth. We'll return to that topic. We think of Maxwell as being primarily theoretical. He did a tremendous amount of experimental work as well. Here he is a young boy. He's making baskets with the help of assistants. He would, with the help of servants. He also discover better ways for his mother to do her knitting. Here's some pictures of Maxwell at play. Here he's teaching his dog with the help of his father to do some tricks. And he always had a dog, as described by Campbell. This was a terrier of the mustard kind called Toby, Tobin, Tobbs, or Tobbit, according to the moment's humor. The owner's current dog, by the way, his name is Toby. Here he's building an inverted pyramid. Here he's tubbing on the oar. And we have the original watercolor. There's a detail from the watercolor, the actual original watercolor. Tubbing on the oar. And you can look, the simplicity, the genius of simplicity. You can see the painting is only about like so. So this is extremely magnified detail. And you can see with just a few strokes, she's got a very good idea of Maxwell expression. You can read that picture, read that expression. What do you think about Maxwell? You can actually start to get some insight into what Maxwell was like as a youngster. His tubbing skills became important later in an escape that he effected. I'll show that in a moment. We think we know where that pool is. And we enlisted the aid of a stout teenager to take a dive. It's very cold in that pool, very cold in the river. Maxwell must have been quite strong. He loved to swim, so we simulated Maxwell and Toby swimming in the pool at the oar. I was only able to get up to about here. And I turned around and got back out. It is cold. And here's a Jemima watercolor. Maxwell, this is Jemima herself. She never really rarely painted her own face. She labeled everybody. This is John Clerk Maxwell, so that's Maxwell's father. JCM, so that's Maxwell himself. And then Mrs. Wedderburn, there's his aunt. Notice Maxwell is paying attention to Mrs. Wedderburn's horse, trying to feed it some hay. Meanwhile, if you ever ride horses, you know, so they see some yummy grass on the side of the trail, they stop and go start to eat the grass. And notice that Maxwell is not watching where he's going. His father's horse has stopped, and he's about to get a sudden introduction to F equals ma, courtesy of the rear end of a horse. Some other things Maxwell liked to do is described by Campbell in that biography I mentioned. He liked to leap ditches, to climb trees, to see them felled and have grand game at getting upon them when falling, to take wasp nests on hot days in July, to blow soap bubbles and marvel at their changing hues. Now, taking wasp nests on a hot day, I'm sure was quite exciting and probably didn't please his mother very much. You know, this kid is trouble. But what speaks to the future here, the foreshadowing, is the changing colors on soap bubbles. In the previous century, Huygens and Newton had a huge, raging battle going back and forth. Huygens said light is composed of waves. Newton said, you fool. Newton was a self-promoting backstabber, as well as being a total genius. You fool, light is composed of particles. And the colors on soap bubbles, they knew at this time, through the work of Thomas Young, colors on soap bubbles were easily explained as a wave phenomenon, wave interference, not explainable by particles. So a wave had to be a wave, it could not be a particle. 1 point for Huygens. We'll return to this discussion in a moment. Other things, you know, I said Maxwell was a kid full of trouble. He was always getting into trouble. And as described by Campbell sets up the situation. We have to imagine what happened. And here's what Campbell says. One evening at Glenlair, just as the maidservant was coming in with a tea tray, Jamesy blew out the light in the narrow, dark passage and lay down across the doorway. Of course, the maid would then fall over with her tea tray full of tree. Now there are some problems in his life. At 8 years old, his mother comes down with stomach cancer. They attempt to operate shortly before her death, unsuccessfully. His comment, when told about his mother's death, seems odd. Oh, I'm so glad. Now she'll have no more pain. Till we realize that at that time, while general anesthetic had been discovered, it was not yet in use. The intensity of this experience on both mother and child today, we cannot even imagine. Maxwell was being tutored by his mother. His mother is dead now, so they have to hire a tutor. The tutor was not a particularly good tutor. In fact, he was quite cruel. Here he's shown escaping from the tutor, using the method of tubbing in the duck pond. In fact, there's Toby, here's his father. And as described in the Campbell biography, the episode of the tutor was not a happy one. I would admit the fact, were I not convinced that this first experience of harsh treatment had effects which long remained. Not in any bitterness, though, to be smitten on the head with a ruler, to have one's ears pulled till they bled, might naturally have operated in that direction, but in a certain hesitation of manner and obliquity of reply, which Maxwell was long in getting over, if indeed he ever quite got over them. Key phrases here are hesitation, manner, and obliquity of reply. Hesitation of manner. Maxwell had trouble talking. He was a very poor lecturer. It wasn't really stuttering. People described it as he had too many ideas in his head, all trying to come out at the same time. Made him a very poor lecturer. He could read aloud prepared text, no problem. Writing was clear as everything. But speaking with just ideas, it was extremely difficult, very difficult to understand him. Combined with the fact he had a Corsac accent. Corsac was the area that he's living in. Very strong accent. I listened to that accent a little bit this summer, and I had to ask for repeats, even though I'm a native English speaker. And it's difficult to understand the accent, and then Maxwell had talking problems on top of that, speech problems. And the obliquity of reply. Maxwell liked to use irony. In irony, you say one thing, but you really mean another. And the problem was, most of the time when he used irony, or some of the time at least, it would go over people's heads. And people thought he meant what he really said. It would be very confusing to people, and I'll give examples. Okay, so Miss Kay discovered the mistreatment, and first, this is the duck pond as it exists today. There's no tub to go tubbing in it. The ducks on the side here are fake ducks. They're not real. He used to have real ducks, but the avian flu did not get them. Instead, some animal rights people in a nearby farm released some mink, and the mink ate the ducks. Okay, so they're going to take Maxwell, and here's the painting itself. Maxwell is going to go to school in Edinburgh. They're moving him to 31 Harriet Row, which is where his aunt, Mrs. Wedderburn, remember Mrs. Wedderburn, his aunt? And he's going to live there in 31 Harriet Row. This is his father. Edinburgh Academy is right here. You come up a relatively steep hill and you're at Harriet Row. 31 Harriet Row is right there. It's about 15 to 20 minute walk. Around the corner is 14 India Street, his birthplace, and down a couple blocks away, 6 Great Stewart Street. That's where his aunt, Miss Kay, the cute little sister, that's where she lives. He spends a lot of time at Miss Kay's home. The 31 Harriet Row, there it is today. It's a very exclusive address, very expensive. Mostly lawyers live there. In fact, Mrs. Wedderburn's husband is Solicitor General, a lawyer for all of Scotland. No idea if the people living here have any idea of the significance of that address. It's converted into 2 flats now. This is 14 India Street, his birthplace, owned by the James Clerk Maxwell Foundation. You can actually have small conferences up here. There's a room, conference room for about 30 to 40 people. Down on the first floor is a beautiful museum. If you ever go to Edinburgh and you're interested in electromagnetics, this is a must-stop place. You have to call ahead. Let me know and I'll be glad to tell you who to contact, and they'll be glad to open it up for you. Here is inside of 6 Great Stewart Street. It's from a Jemima watercolor. Walk in the front door, go all the way back, look to the right, and there is Maxwell doing homework. And here's 6 Great Stewart Street today. Edinburgh Academy, the pictures from a few years before Maxwell went there. He went there in 1841, and it looks much the same today, very similar today. It was a leading edge educational institution at the time. Of course, that's like 150 years plus ago, so it sounds a little antiquated now. For example, they boasted that their boys at 12 years old could conjugate 800 irregular Greek verbs. Difficult job to ask 12-year-olds today to do. Maxwell didn't like that. It was a lot of memorization. He called it muggery. He didn't do well with memorization. He liked to understand things. And first 3 years, in fact, at Edinburgh Academy, he did very poorly. The full 6 years, the second 3 years he was there, he started to get on some of the prize lists and such. But the first 3 years were really miserable. Also, he didn't get along well with people. He made a couple friends. Lewis Campbell is one that did his biography. Another one was P.G. Tate. P.G. Tate was like a straight A, perfect, always had the right answer guy. Maxwell and P.G. Tate were the very best of friends throughout their lives. Sometimes Tate would win, sometimes Maxwell would win, extremely competitive, but always friends, even when one won and the other lost in a competitive situation. And Tate, while he did everything perfectly, he was not the genius. Maxwell would make, you could look through his papers in some detail today. You can find little mistakes he made here and there. He wasn't always perfect. Maxwell, however, was the genius. What happened in the interval after the first lesson, in the space behind the second classroom, is best indicated in the words of the Bible. They came about me like bees. Who made those shoes? Was the first question, but it was never easy to get a direct answer from Maxwell, least of all on compulsion. Brought thus to bay, he had recourse to his natural weapon, irony. His answer was soon ready, and his tormentors might make of it whatever they wish. In the broadest tones of his Corsican accent, he replied to one of them, "Div ye ken, it was a man, and he lived in a house in which was a mouse." He returned to Harriet Row that afternoon, his coat in rags and lacking the skirt, his neat frill rumpled and torn, himself excessively amused by his experiences, showing not the smallest sign of irritation. First day at school, Maxwell got beat up. And as a bit of irony here, if you turn around from this location and look back 180 degrees, there's a building that's being torn down. It will be, they'll be constructing a state-of-the-art auditorium, and it will be called the James Clerk Maxwell Auditorium. So the bullies that beat him up, their ghost will have to watch the James Clerk Maxwell Auditorium. Maxwell was quite a poet. Oh, a couple of things before we talk about the poetry. He never talked about this tormenting. It went on for the whole 6 years, most intensely for the first 3 years. But he said in later years, they never understood me, but I understood them. And let's face it, especially for the first 3 years, this kid is not doing very well in classes, getting poor grades. He doesn't make friends. He's hard to understand. He wears funny clothes. The kid is a loser. You know, deal with it. And then, almost as a aside, in a letter he writes to his father in June of 1844, he writes, this is before he has any training at all in geometry. He writes, I have made a tetrahedron, a dodecahedron, and 2 other hedrons whose names I do not know. 2 other hedrons whose names he does not know. Maybe we should keep an eye on this kid. As I mentioned, he was quite a poet. There's a lot of his poetry in the biography. It gives us some, it's not world-class poetry, but it does give us some insight into his personality, his thoughts. This poem was written at age 14 in his own hand, illustrated by himself. The title is The Vampire. The sweet young maiden lures the gallant knight into a boat off into the middle of a pond, and the gallant knight meets a very gruesome end. I'll let you read about it in the biography if you want to find out what happened. This one was at age 14. Another thing he did at age 14 was publish his first paper on oval curves. Now, when I was a kid, I stuck 2 pins in a piece of paper, tied a string around them, put a pencil in, and then drew a beautiful ellipse. That's where you've probably done the same thing. That's where I stopped. That's probably where you stopped too. Maxwell went further. He said, well, what if I put in 3 pins? And here we see first pin, string tied to it, goes around the pencil, around the second pin, around the third pin, and ties off to the pencil. Now when you move the pencil, you draw an oval curve. Every point on that curve, the sum of the distances to 3 foci is a constant. Instead of 2 foci for an ellipse, you have 3 foci. Well, you do 4 or 5. Or maybe wrap the string back and forth a couple times. You have twice the distance to this foci, plus the distance to this foci are a constant. And Maxwell wrote this up, and he and his father took it to a family friend, Professor Forbes. Remember Professor Forbes. He'll come back into our story in a moment. And Professor Forbes took it to some colleagues and said that, well, this has been done before, but by Newton and Huygens. Newton and Descartes. They investigated these curves for optical properties, but they didn't come up with this neat way of drawing the curves. So it's worth publishing. Now, Maxwell himself couldn't get up and present it at the Royal Society. That's how you publish papers. You present it at the Royal Society because it felt improper for a 14-year-old to mount the podium at the Royal Society. So Professor Forbes actually presents the paper. And that's Maxwell's first paper, Oval Curves. The original of this paper, the entire paper is published in the biography, the last 2 pages in Maxwell's own handwriting. The original paper in Maxwell's handwriting is on display at the 14 India Street Museum in Edinburgh, his birthplace museum. Maxwell's first work with polarized light, this was really critical. And Campbell was actually there when it happened. As Campbell reports, in the spring of 1847, his uncle, Mr. John Kay, took James and myself to see Mr. Nicol, a friend of Sir David Brewster, that's Brewster of Brewster's Angle, and the inventor of the polarizing prism. Now, if you take Iceland spar, the polarizing prism was made out of Iceland spar. You take a piece of Iceland spar, which I have one right here. It's a form of crystalline calcite. And you hold it over a line on a piece of paper. Some of you down here closer can see it. If you can't see it, feel free to come down after the presentation and check it out. Hold it over the paper, you see 2 lines. The 2 lines today, we know one is a vertical polarization, one is horizontal polarization. It's birefringent. In those days, the only thing they knew was, they called it ordinary ray and extraordinary ray. They knew there's two kinds of light. And now let's go back to Huygens. Huygens said light is a wave. Well, if light is a wave, the only way you can have two kinds of light is if it's transverse vibration, vertical and horizontal. If it's longitudinal, you only have one kind of light. So we know if light is a wave, it must be transverse vibration. Now this vibration has to travel in a media. They call it luminiferous ether. This is the 19th century. It has to have something to travel in. It can't travel by itself. So luminiferous ether, a transverse wave. Now we receive sunlight from the sun, but the Earth in its orbit is plowing through this luminiferous ether. If there were any shear strength to this medium, the Earth would spiral into the sun. Earth is not spiraling into the sun, so this luminiferous ether must have zero shear strength. Now the problem. You cannot have a transverse wave in a zero shear strength medium. Can't happen. Light cannot possibly be a wave. 1 point for Newton. Light must be a particle. Polarized light, what Maxwell did when he got, Nicole was so impressed with him, he gave him 2 sets of polarizing prisms based on the Iceland spar. And with one set, you polarized the light, and then Maxwell went to Mrs. K's home, ground up some glass, melted it, put it in this case, a triangular mold, poured the molten glass in, cooled the glass very quickly, so there's lots of stress and strain in there. Put this piece of glass now on top of the first prism, and the second prism is called the analyzer, a common experiment in sophomore physics. And you get these pretty colors coming out based on the index of refraction of the light varying. And he built a camera lucida, which projects this image on the table, and then he sit there and painted the image on the projection. This is in his own hand with watercolor. This is the painting. The stresses and strain in glass. Professor Stokes is a family friend. He solves Stokes equations for stresses and strains in a solid and publishes measured versus calculated. This is his first work with fields, the field being a vector defined over a space. The formal mathematical concept of field does not yet exist. But it is a vector defined over a space, the stresses and strains. It's very physical, it's not an abstract thing. So he's done with high school. They send him off to Edinburgh Academy. He is not at all, they send him to University of Edinburgh. He's not at all challenged there. Spent 3 years there, kind of just coasting along. They finally decide to go ahead and send him to Cambridge. And Cambridge is the best mathematical university in the entire world at that time. If you want an education in mathematics, now mathematics is considered something valuable at this point, or getting to be considered valuable. And so they finally send him to Cambridge, although they were quite hesitant to do so because it's an English university, and the Scots and the English, there's a little bit of suspicion between the two and distrust. But even though they're both in the United Kingdom, they finally do decide to send him there. It was a very good move. He starts out at Peterhouse College. Cambridge is a bunch of colleges. Each college has its own dormitory, its own tutors, its own scholarships. And he starts out at Peterhouse, which is mostly mathematicians. They switch to Trinity, not known for sure why, but Trinity has a greater variety of people he could interact with and perhaps less competition for the scholarships. For whatever reason, they do switch him to Trinity. Cavendish Laboratory is what he establishes. He's the founding director later in life. He comes back and establishes Cavendish Laboratory. Now, what you do when you go to Cambridge is you study to pass the Tripos exam. And if this is a very difficult exam, if you pass the Tripos exam, if you're number 1, you're like rock star status. And remember his buddy P.G. Tate, the straight A, always right kid? P.G. Tate has accelerated a year ahead of Maxwell. And P.G. Tate the previous year was first wrangler, first placed on the Tripos exam. Unfortunately, just before the exam, he's visiting some friends, and he describes to Campbell what happened. I intended to return on the 18th of June, but on the 17th I felt unwell and took measures accordingly to be well again, i.e. went to bed, made up my mind to recover. But it lasted more than a fortnight, during which time I was taken care of beyond expectation. When I was perfectly useless and could not sit up without fainting, they did everything for me in such a way I had no fear of giving trouble. They kept me in great happiness and detained me until I was able to walk about and got back to strength on the 4th of July. He returned to Cambridge, took the Tripos exam, and came in second. First place was Routh, R-O-U-T-H. If you do control theory, you may be familiar with the Routh stability criterion, one and the same. A little bit of a disappointment. He did, when he was leaving the Tripos exam, it's a very intense physical experience. It said that he was staggering a little bit as he left the exam. As a consolation prize, he a little later took the Smiths-Prizeman exam, came in tied for first on the Smiths-Prizeman exam. I have a copy of the exam. If you want it, I'd be glad to email it to you. It is a very difficult exam. I assure you, if you use that for your PhD qualifying exam today, you will have no PhD candidates. Just email me. I'll be glad to email you a copy of the exam if you'd like. While at Cambridge, Maxwell did a few things. This is a picture of him at Cambridge. One thing I'd like you to do is look at those eyes again. This kid, there's fire in those eyes. He's getting into trouble all over the place. One of the things he got into trouble with, let me describe to you. He liked to exercise, a little unconventional here, described by Campbell. From 2 to 2:30 a.m., he took exercise by running along the upper corridor, down the stairs, and along the lower corridor, then up the stairs and so on, until the inhabitants of rooms along his track got up and lay things behind their sporting doors to have shots at him with boots and hairbrushes as he passed. I don't know, maybe dorms are still like that today. One of the things Maxwell worked with was this color top, or what's illustrated here is this color spinning disc. And this is another example of the simplicity of genius. In the previous few years, Thomas Young had developed what's called the tricolor theory of light. You know, how many primary colors of light are there? 2, 3, 4, 5? Thomas Young said there's 3. Not sure how he came to that conclusion, but he came to the right conclusion. Now, what are the primary colors of light? What are the 3 colors? He took a guess. The guess wasn't really, it was in the ballpark, but it wasn't really quite right. Maxwell decided to get quantitative about it. So what Maxwell did is he built this color disk, and he also had an equivalent color top. And what he did was on the inner circle, you'd have like 80% black and 20% white. On the outer circle, you'd have X% something, Y% something else, and so on. You'd have, and then you spin. You take the disk and spin it, and you adjust the percentages until you get the same color inside and outside. And now you've got an equation. 20% white plus 80% black equals ... You do this for a whole bunch of colors. And now you go to your linear algebra. You find a basis that spans that space. An orthogonal basis that spans that space. The orthogonal basis was red, green, and blue, the primary colors of light. Maxwell figured that out. You remember the tile floor? Red, green, and blue. And those colors were very important to Maxwell. Another thing he started working on was Faraday's lines of force. Let me give you some background here on electromagnetics. At this time, magnetic field did not exist. They had what was called action at a distance. And this was very well verified by Coulomb, had verified it quantitatively. Priestley and Cavendish had discussed this possibility qualitatively. And it also had Newton's action at a distance. This is Coulomb's law. You know, the charge between spheres varies with 1 over r squared. And it had Newton's implicit approval. Newton is the lord and ruler over all physics at this time. If your work didn't go back to Newton, you know, it's get away from me, kid, you bother me. You couldn't be taken seriously. So Newton, action at a distance had Newton's approval because he did the theory of gravitation. That was action, 2 gravitating bodies, it's action at a distance. You got a body here, it does action over here. And so that had Newton's approval, action at a distance. They do the same thing for electrostatic charge. You have something equivalent for magnetic force as well. And you know, this was well established in physics. A very simple idea. You know, it didn't work if you had time varying charges or something was moving. You know, they would try to figure out something. Ampere would try to put some corrections in action at a distance to make it work for something that was time varying, but, you know, didn't obey conservation of energy. Little details. But, you know, they'll get figured out. So now up comes Faraday's lines of force. And let's give you a little background on Faraday for just a second here. Maxwell came from a very well family. Very well-off family, fairly wealthy. Faraday came from a relatively poor family. His father was a blacksmith, died when he was age 8 or so. He was apprenticed to a bookbinder. He liked to read the books he was binding. One of the books was Encyclopedia Britannica. He read an article on electricity. He was absolutely amazed with electricity. He wanted to become a scientist. The worst way, become a scientist, to study electricity. One problem is people in his class, Victorian England is very class conscious. The people in his class never, ever went to college. He never had a university education. And how he became one of the Britain's most famous scientists is another incredible story, which we'll leave for another day. But he started exploring magnetic induction using the coil. This coil right here, in fact. And magnetic induction, it kind of made sense. Remember, we can't talk about magnetic fields yet, because magnetic fields don't exist yet. So they knew if you put electricity into an inductor, you made a magnet. So see, nature likes symmetry, right? So if you have a magnet, you should be able to make electricity. Makes sense. They call it induction, even though they hadn't discovered it yet. People had tried to discover magnetic induction. It didn't work. Faraday tried it. It didn't work. Sorry, folks. Magnets just don't make electricity. End of experiment. Open the switch. What was that? The needle quivered for just a second and stopped. Close the switch back down. The needle quivers for just a second and it stops again. Aha! It's a changing magnet that makes electricity. In Maxwell's equations today, dB by dt term. We've got to take the derivative. We've got to change the magnet. Notice no magnetic field. Didn't have a concept of magnetic field yet. So Faraday postulates this electrotonic state. That's what he called it, electrotonic state around the magnet. And it's changes in this mysterious, invisible electrotonic state that causes things like induction and force. Everybody says, Faraday, you're crazy. We got this action at distance. Works great. We don't need your invisible electrotonic state. Maxwell starts working with this at this time. He calls it electromagnetic momentum. You have mechanical momentum, mv. You take the derivative with respect to time, you get force. This electromagnetic momentum, you take the derivative with respect to time and you get force. So it's called it electromagnetic momentum. We'll identify what electromagnetic momentum is a little later in the lecture. It's not magnetic field. Maxwell was extremely religious. Campbell does us a great disservice by not describing in detail Maxwell's religious beliefs, even though he has undoubtedly understood them well because he's a longtime friend of Maxwell, and he was a minister too. He was being polite by Victorian standards. By modern biographical standards, this would be a grievous sin. But there are quite a few letters that Maxwell had on Maxwell's religious beliefs, and here's one. I'll read some sections of it. In a letter to Campbell, he writes, "Now my great plan is a plan of search and recovery. The rule is to let nothing be left willfully unexamined. Nothing is to be holy ground consecrated to stationary title, whether positive or negative. I assert the right of trespass on any plot of holy ground which any man has set apart." This is actually a fairly modern attitude. I think most any engineer or scientist today, religious or agnostic, will agree with that statement. Effectively, what Maxwell is saying is if you have a hypothesis that can be tested, that is a matter for science, and it should be tested. It is not a matter for religion. If you have a hypothesis that cannot be tested, that is a matter for faith, and then is a matter for religion. So there's this wall that divides religion from science. There's no overlap between the two. This is how Maxwell, one of the world's 3 greatest physicists of all time, can also be extremely religious, as he puts a wall between the religion and the science. If you have a hypothesis can be tested, it's science. If it can't be tested, then it's a matter of faith for religion. Now, he makes a statement, if we unfairly judge that by modern standards, It doesn't come off too well today, but I give it to you to give you some insight into Maxwell. He says at the end of the letter, "Now I am convinced that no one but a Christian can actually purge his land of these holy spots." And I think we would all agree today that most any engineer or scientist of any faith can purge his land of these holy spots. He graduates from Cambridge, applies for a position at Marshall College in Aberdeen. His father would have been very pleased to have heard that he had become a Scottish professor, but before he's accepted in a position, his father passes away. He describes in a letter to Miss Kay, "My father died today at 12 o'clock. He was sleepless and confused at night, but got up to breakfast. He came into the drawing room, sat down on a chair for a few moments to rest, and gave a short cry and never spoke again. We gave him ether for a little, but he could not swallow. There was no warning, no pain." Maxwell was extremely close to his father. This hit him really hard. He starts his position at Aberdeen. He describes his work at Aberdeen, his opinion of Aberdeen. He says, "Society is pretty steady here, plenty of diversity, but little of great merit or demerit, honest on the whole. However, no jokes of any kind are understood here. I have not made one for 2 months, and if I feel one coming, I shall bite my tongue." They simply did not understand his use of irony, so he had to be very careful and not use irony to make any jokes. About a year, this is the last Jemima watercolor, about a year after his father's death, family picnic, Maxwell's here. Can you see him? This watercolor is only about 6 by 9 inches. Let's zoom up here. Right there is where he is. We'll zoom up on it. There he is, with a beard here. Look at Maxwell. Can you read that face? What's he thinking? When I read that face, what I can see him sitting there thinking is, "Gee, Dad should be here." Family picnic, and he misses his father. He's very sad. His father's death really took him for a loop. He gets married at Marshall College, Aberdeen. It seems like his wife, Catherine, married Dewar. I don't know if it's any relation to Dewar Flask. Seems like a very good political move, because she is the daughter of the principal. And the principal is lord and ruler over the entire college. Whatever he says goes. So this is pretty cool. He's married to daughter of the principal, but Maxwell was never political. Let's try to read these people. Look at the expression there. There's Catherine, pretty hair, pretty dress, something a little uncomfortable. I can't put my finger on it. A little uncomfortable about her expression, her face. Look at her eyes. Something little not so cool there. Here's Maxwell, looking down at his wife with devotion. Well, there's something more than just devotion there. He's sad too. And I don't know if it's his, he's still remembering his father or what. There's some sadness in that picture. Let's look at after 11 years of marriage now. Here's a photograph. This is not a painting, it's a photograph. After 11 years of marriage. And let's look at this in a little bit of detail. The dog is not a terrier of the mustard kind. It's either a fake dog or she selected the dog. The dress, we've got a fake background. The dress is now kind of scary, and the hairstyle is a little scary, at least by our modern standards. Maybe we'll give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe by Victorian standards, this was 150 or so years ago. By Victorian standards, maybe it looks just fine. Let's concentrate on the face here. Let's read the face. And when I read that expression, what I see is someone who's trying very hard to look pleasant, but not succeeding. In fact, she was extremely abrasive. None of Maxwell's friends liked her. She was said at a party, for just one example, she was overheard at a party telling James, "James, it appears you are starting to enjoy yourself, therefore we must leave." And back when Maxwell was at Cambridge, forgot to mention this, back when he was at Cambridge, Maxwell had a hot summer romance with a cousin, first cousin, Elizzie. Now, getting married to your first cousin, it's not so okay at that time, but it did happen. Queen Victoria married her first cousin. That was a very good marriage. She was 13, he was 22, a little big on the age difference. They broke off the romance at the end of the summer, presumably because of the age difference, and be kind of a tight loop on the family tree. So, Catherine knew about that. And apparently there was a little bit of jealousy there, because when Maxwell writes a letter back to Miss K about being engaged here, the letter is almost apologetic. It's like he knows there's going to be trouble. And indeed there is. Prior to the engagement to Catherine, Maxwell has a lot of written communication with the K family. After the engagement, there is no written communication, no letters, with the female side of the K family. It's like they wouldn't talk to him anymore. In fact, one of the Ks was quoted as saying, "Before this, Maxwell stood on heaven's doorstep." So they didn't like that. Her friends, Maxwell's friends, never liked his wife. One of the most telling things is the biography, the Campbell biography. In those days, it's kind of a sugar-coated biography. Campbell doesn't say some of the bad things. Likes to only tell the good things. And if he can't say something good about somebody, he doesn't say anything at all. And about Catherine, he says absolutely nothing. Not one word, anywhere. He does talk about Maxwell being an extremely devoted husband. In fact, he prints several letters where Maxwell says that Catherine saved his life on several occasions. Once, shortly after Marshall College, where he had smallpox, usually fatal disease. She nursed him back to health. Another time later, he was riding horse in Kensington Park in London, scratched his head on a branch, became infected, syphilis, bacterial infection, often fatal. She nursed him back to health. She helped him a lot on his thermodynamic experiments, carrying ice and carrying wood for a fire to do different temperatures for viscosity of gases. She loaned a number of things to Campbell for doing in the biography. Campbell gave them back to her, and they were never seen again, presumably destroyed. She became neurotic in her old age. The saddest thing on this picture is look at Maxwell's eyes. The fire is gone. Totally gone. Still very, very productive scientifically, though. While at Aberdeen, he starts working on rings of Saturn. He won the Adams Prize. Adams, you may recall, figured out that if, Englishman, he figured out that if, based on the orbit of Uranus, that there should be another planet out here. He gave the coordinates to Sir George Airy, the astronomer royal, and said, look at this position and you'll see a new planet. Sir Airy never looked. Leverrier, a Frenchman, did the same calculation a year later, went to Berlin Observatory and said, look at this position, you'll see a new planet. Within almost literally a few minutes, they found Neptune. Now it's the world. Frenchmen discovered a new planet. Sir George Airy says, wait a minute, we did those calculations a year ago. So the big battle going back and forth. Adams on who discovered Neptune. Adams stays above it, establishes a prize for astronomy. And the prize for this year was, what are Saturn's rings? Are they solid? Are they liquid? Or are they a bunch of particles? Maxwell figures out if they're solid, they would require such a weird mass distribution to keep tidal forces from tearing them apart. It's not what we see, so they can't be solid. If it's liquid, small perturbations in the ring will grow without limit, and the rings will dissipate. So it has to be bunches of little moons. This is before any pictures of Saturn's rings up close like we have today. And he built this model, in fact, of a ring of moonlets and has a traveling wave on it. Some of the moons are inside and some go outside. You get a traveling wave there going back and forth. He is so close. Remember the Voyager pictures of the braided rings? Put two of these together, you got braided rings. So close. And this is a many-body problem. I won't spend too much time talking about thermodynamics. Maxwell did a lot on thermal. But it paves the way for theory of gases, little balls bouncing around, making temperature and pressure. Thunderclouds on the horizon. Maxwell's Marshall College and then King's College of Aberdeen, there are many King's Colleges, this one in Aberdeen, will be fused. There are 2 professors for each position, the natural philosophy, which they call physics at that time. There are 2 professors. They are going to take the younger professor, who has less tenure, and terminate the older professor with more tenure. The reason is to minimize pension costs. Maxwell is the younger professor with less tenure. And he's married to the daughter of the principal of Marshall College, so it seems like he's got it made. However, you remember his nickname was Dafty? Well, his opponent's nickname is Crafty. Crafty gets the position. Don't know why. It's not due to Maxwell's inability to lecture. It's his now worldwide reputation for mathematics because of the rings of Saturn problem. Nothing to do with it either. But for some reason, Crafty pulls some strings, somehow and gets the position. So Maxwell is terminated from his position. He's out of a job. University of Edinburgh. Remember Professor Forbes, the family friend? He's retiring. Great. Maxwell's going to get the position. P.G. Tate got the position. And they're quite explicit about why they took Tate. Remember, Tate's that straight A, always right, very good friend of Maxwell. Tate wins this one. He gets the position, and he gets the position because he can lecture. Maxwell can't. Finally applies for a position at King's College, in which he is successful. King's College here in London. Today it's 16 Palace Gardens Terrace, Kensington Park, where he scratched his head. Right here they call it Kensington Gardens. And the university is in here on the river, right next to Somerset House, where they have many society meetings. And there's the inside of King's College today. This is King's College London, different from King's College Aberdeen that fused. Remember red, green, and blue? Maxwell had this bright idea. Why don't I take 3 pictures of the same object? In this case, it's a tartan ribbon. One through a red filter, one through a blue filter, one through a green filter. We have the negatives. Those are the negatives right there in the background, each viewed through an appropriate filter. Those are the original negatives. And, okay, we got the 3 pictures. Now we'll have 3 projectors, one with a red, green, and blue filter each. And we'll project the pictures. He did this at a meeting of the Royal Society, the first color picture. And there it is, projected in almost exactly the same way Maxwell did it. Instead of having 3 projectors in 3 boxes, we've got 1 projector, or 3 projectors in 1 box up there. Just exactly the same way, projecting just exactly the same way Maxwell did, just a little better on the mechanical aspects of the technology. A few years back, some wise guy pointed out, you know, the colloidal film process they used back then was totally, completely, absolutely insensitive to red. Couldn't be any red in the picture. But wait a minute, there is red in the picture. Look, right there. See it? How did it get there? Well, it turns out the film was very sensitive to ultraviolet light, and the red filter also passed ultraviolet light. So it's really ultraviolet, green, and blue. Maxwell still gets credit for the first color photograph, however. Speed of light. He did 3 papers, 1855, 1862, and 1865. In the 1862 paper, he's finally figuring out that the speed of light, as you calculate it, based on what we today call epsilon and mu, is very similar to the value that you measure mechanically. And what we have here is we have this speed calculated from epsilon and mu, strictly from electrostatic and magnetostatic experiments. And then you have this value, which is calculated from a spinning wheel. A spinning wheel with mirrors on it. You can actually mechanically calculate the speed of light. And here's the modern value. Notice that these two are actually quite a bit closer than the correct value. There may have been a little bit of influence on here. One thing on the mass of the electron, if you ever plot the mass of an electron as a function of time, the accepted mass, the true mass is here, and Thomson had a mass up here, and the values would gradually converge on the correct values because they thought the error bars were actually bigger than what they thought they were. So if somebody came up with a correct answer, they thought it had to be wrong. So they would reject it and not publish it. Only publish it if they had similar errors. It gradually comes closer. The same sort of thing happened with speed of light. But here's the exact value today, and the physicists have taken all the fun out of it. It's a defined constant now. I don't know if you measure the meter or the second, but you don't get any headlines by measuring a meter more accurately or a second more accurately. So. Okay, he's done at Cambridge, goes into a semi-retirement. back at Glen Lair. He finishes his treatise. He's got 3 papers he published. 1865 is where he actually had the full electromagnetic theory. And he goes and works on the electricity and magnetism, treatise on electricity and magnetism. This is the founding document for modern electromagnetics. You can get a Dover reprint of this. Highly recommended if you do a lot of work with electromagnetics. See where some of the things that we do today come from. And publishes that 1873. He winds up his work on thermodynamics as well, or completes a good part of it. 1871, he's asked to return to Cambridge to establish the Cavendish Laboratory. Duke of Devonshire, his ancestor is Henry Cavendish, and he donates a lot of money to Cambridge to establish Cavendish Laboratory. While there, Maxwell wrote up a series of articles on various things for the Encyclopedia Britannica, 1892. I have the whole set. It's really neat reading. This is the first one, atom. Atom is a speculative concept at this time. People aren't sure whether the atom exists or not. It had been speculated on since 300 BC and before. But at this time, the atom is not verified until, experimentally verified, until Einstein's work 100 years ago, 1905, his miracle year, on Brownian motion. At this point, Maxwell's pretty sure atoms exist because his kinetic theory of gases, little balls bouncing around, that works really, really well. But when he writes an article on atoms, he has to, maybe you can read it here, it says the doctrine of infinite divisibility of bodies. He also has to talk about that a little bit because that theory hasn't been ruled out as yet. Here also something very uncharacteristic of Maxwell happens. There's a big controversy. In this case with the theory of gas, in the rarefied theory of gases. Maxwell realizes that electromagnetic theory creates what we today call photon pressure. Okay, so you could build, we call it a radiometer, and you have a little windmill inside a vacuum, little sphere with vacuum, windmill, and the flags are white on one side and black on the other. So photons should hit the white side, push the white side, white pushing, black leading, and go around. And so they build one, put out in the sun, and gee, it whirls around pretty fast. Great, it works. Photon pressure really exists. Wait a minute, some wise guy pointed out. It's spinning in the wrong direction. Black is being pushed and white is leaning. It's going in the wrong direction. So Reynolds, you may know of Reynolds' number, Reynolds figures out, well, maybe there's a rarefied gas in there. It's just a little bit of gas and it's boiling off the hotter black side. So black pushes white leads going around. And he writes a paper, submits it for review. Maxwell is the reviewer. Maxwell writes a scathing review of it, sends it back, and then Maxwell writes his own paper on the theory of rarefied gases, corrects Reynolds' work, adds some more to it, and he does give Reynolds attribution. He says, he points out, Reynolds did this, this, and this, and publishes. But the attribution is not good enough for Reynolds. Reynolds is absolutely livid. He is very, very angry. They have many very angry letters going back and forth. It's really funny reading them, the polite Victorian language throwing out these scathing insults. They go on like this for a bit, and then Lord Kelvin, William Thomson, long time Maxwell friend, intervenes, and he tells Reynolds that Maxwell is mortally ill. Maybe he ought to back off. And Reynolds does indeed back off. He was declined for several years. They could see it coming. And a longtime Maxwell friend, Colin Mackenzie, was there, along with his wife and Dr. Paget. Colin Mackenzie reports, a few minutes before his death, Professor Clerk Maxwell was being held up in bed, struggling for breath, when he said slowly and distinctly, "God help me, God help my wife." Then he turned to me and said, "Colin, you are strong, lift me up." He next said, "Lay me down lower, for I am very low myself, and it suits me to lie low." After this he breathed deeply and slowly, and with a long look at his wife, passed away. James Clerk Maxwell was dead at the age of 48 of the same disease that took his mother, stomach cancer, precisely 40 years earlier. This is the original tombstone. We believe it was put in place by lawyers closing up the estate after the death of Catherine. Notice that Maxwell's mother is listed second, even though she was the first to die. There's no birth dates, and there is no "in fond loving memory of" or anything like that on the tombstone. The tombstone is at a small church near his home. This is the ruins, actually, of a church that was built in around 1500. It is just off to the right is a much larger church that Maxwell's father built that is in use today. And all four are buried here. We usually teach that Maxwell's legacy is that he had these four simple equations, saw the obvious symmetry or lack of symmetry, and added the displacement current, the dE by dt term, that the current flows through the dielectric in a capacitor. This is undoubtedly not true. He did add the displacement current, but not from the obvious symmetry. First, Maxwell viewed the electromagnetic momentum as primary. Today we call electromagnetic momentum magnetic vector potential. It was primary, a view returning to popularity in physics today. He treated magnetic field and electric field as secondary, derived from the magnetic vector potential. And he did not have vector calculus, no div, no curl. He wrote out every single equation without the benefit of vector notation. He had 20 equations and 20 variables with magnetic vector potential as primary. If you look at those equations, you will see no symmetry whatsoever. When I read historians, what historians say, how did he discover the displacement current? There are no notes or anything leading or showing us his pattern of thought on this matter. The only thing they can do is say, the guy was a genius. He introduced the field concept, and he used the term field like as a place where things happen. The formal mathematical concept of a field does not yet exist. That's introduced by Gibbs, Josiah Willard Gibbs, after Maxwell's death. The modern form of Maxwell's equations was never seen by Maxwell. It was developed by Heaviside and Hertz independently after Maxwell's death. Heaviside took Maxwell's treatise and converted the equations into their modern form by using basically algebra and mathematics. Hertz did the same thing by taking action at a distance and using local area corrections, come up with the same set of equations. Hertz went on, of course, to validate the equations experimentally. Look at Heaviside. He's on the top. Read that face. What kind of person was Heaviside? He was really cranky, very outspoken, usually right, too, which made it especially frustrating for those who were incompetent, which he had a number of run-ins with. There's a beautiful biography, Oliver Heaviside, Sage and Solitude. Must read him for anybody deeply into electromagnetics. Heaviside died senile. He fell off, as an old man, he fell off a ladder while trying to repair his roof. His ride to the hospital was his first and final ride in an automobile. Hertz, who went on to experimentally verify Maxwell's equations, died in his mid-30s. We lost Maxwell in his late 40s. Hertz we lost in his mid-30s after blood poisoning developed, after an operation for jaw cancer. Why is magnetic field B? Electric field being E, I can understand that. Displacement vector D, I can understand that. Why is magnetic field B? Doesn't make sense. And then I asked a bunch of people, got some pretty believable answers, but I don't think any of them were true, because leafing through the treatise on electricity and magnetism, on page, I think it was 511, found this table. Magnetic field, the magnetic vector potential is A, because that's the quantity Maxwell viewed as primary. And the magnetic field is B, because that's secondary. He attempted a physical interpretation. In his first paper, 1855, he did electrostatics and used equations for incompressible fluid flow. He is quite emphatic that incompressible fluid flow does not explain why we see these things. It's only that nature likes to use the same equations in different places. And so he found that nature was using the same equations for electrostatics and magnetostatics as she was using for incompressible fluid flow. It didn't offer an explanation. In his 1862 paper, he's got to have something that goes back to Newton. Something goes back to F equals ma, or people aren't going to take it serious. He had this network of gears and idle wheels and such to explain this luminiferous ether that could support a transverse wave without having any shear strength. Pretty awkward, but he put it in there as a tip of the hat to Newton. So you got F equals ma in there. 1865 is where he made the brilliant jump. He completely eliminated any mechanical explanation, no acknowledgement to Newton whatsoever, nothing with F equals ma, and as a direct result, people ignored it. Lord Kelvin went to his grave convinced that Maxwell's electromagnetic theory was wrong. It wasn't until 20 years later that when Hertz finally verified it experimentally that people started taking it seriously. Freeman Dyson puts it in terms of there's two levels. The abstract field level, which we cannot perceive, and then there's the upper level, which is pushing and pulling and heating that we can perceive. I get hit by a ball, I can feel the joules. Measure a cubic meter, give me a stick. You want to measure energy density, get a calorimeter. Measure the joules, and then get a stick to measure the cubic meter. Joules per cubic meter is energy density. E squared is proportional energy density. Take the square root of E squared, and you've got electric field. Take the square root of joules per cubic meter. What are the units? It's square root of joules per square root of cubic meter. We cannot perceive this. How do you measure the square root of a joules directly? The square root of a calorimeter? How do you measure, what kind of stick do you use to measure the square root of a cubic meter? It's beyond our perception. We cannot perceive the second level directly, the electric and magnetic fields. They're abstract mathematics. We dive into this level to do all our calculations. I've been doing that for 20 years. And when we come out of this level with E squared, H squared, or E times H, we can calculate real things that we can really see and perceive. But the abstract level we don't have any perception of. And that's the key thing, that's Maxwell's key legacy to us, is being able to dive into this abstract level and then to do our calculations without pretending to understand that we understand why. Why does a magnet attract a piece of iron? I asked my teacher in grade school. The teacher replies, it's because of the magnetic field. But why does a magnet attract a piece of iron? Frankly, we still do not understand why. We don't know the answer to that question. We can calculate it to the nth degree, but why? We don't know. This is discussed in more detail in the essay by Freeman Dyson. I can email that to you if you want as well. I think it's available on the web as well. It's a beautiful essay by Freeman Dyson describing this. He was one of the prime architects of the quantum electrodynamics as well. In conclusion, I'll quote from the Freeman Dyson essay. The ultimate importance of Maxwell theory is far greater than its immediate achievement in explaining and unifying the phenomenon of electricity and magnetism. Its ultimate importance is to be the prototype for all the great triumphs of 20th century physics. It is a prototype for Einstein's theories of relativity, for quantum mechanics, and for the unified theory of fields and particles that is known as the standard model of particle physics. All these theories are based on the concept of dynamical fields introduced by Maxwell in 1865. Thus it is that Maxwell freed all of engineering of science from the womb of Newtonian mechanics and F equals ma, setting us free to set the stage for all of the amazing developments of 20th century physics. Thank you for your kind attention. Okay. Yeah, what were you like?
Okay, I think now and then we can have a 10-minute break and before the second part. Yeah. So during the 10-minute break, and you can then come to the CD and also the documents.